The Onewheel Pint X. This, until the GT is released, is the latest Onewheel released by Future Motion at some point last year. And is it incredible? Is it complete and utter trash? Or, like most things, is it somewhere in the middle? Let's go find out.
Okay. No.
By the way, before we get started, if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe. A lot more coming to the channel, more Onewheel content, and quite a bit of DIY electric skateboard and battery stuff as well. And that being said, we cannot have a proper Pint X review without talking about the foot sensor issues. I've experienced it since day one with the Pint X, so for this particular section, I'm just going to talk about the issues, what I've come to learn about them, what I've experienced with them, and if this is a bit of a long, drawn-out thing that you're not interested in, feel free to just skip ahead to the rest of the review. I won't take it personally, but this is stuff that I think should at least be addressed, because it's a thing. So essentially what many folks are experiencing is an issue with the sensitivity of the sensor itself. You go to get on the Onewheel and it doesn't turn on. But what might be causing this though? Because this was not an issue as far as I can remember with the Pint Regular, which I've had since that released a couple of years ago. So it seems that newer pints, the Pint X, and also newer plastic foot pads are being made and released with an extra layer of protective plastic film on top of the original assembly of the sensor pad. This makes it more difficult for them to engage and activate the motor, and it does seem to be the case that this is not just on the Pint X, but newer pints and the most recent batches of the Onewheel XR that have been released all had foot pads, sensor pads with this design change. Now, of course, this is only an issue that I've seen crop up with the release of the Pint X. I don't think necessarily that this was a change. In fact, it likely wasn't a change that only had to do with the Pint X. But there's always a correlation with the release of a new model, and then there's media buzz, and then customer talk about it. So that's likely why this has come to the forefront more so now than it had previously. So what can you do about this? Shoe choice does seem to have somewhat of an effect. It certainly does for me. If I'm wearing my Vans, then it's a bit more of an effort to get the sensor to engage and for the motor to turn on properly. And if I'm wearing just regular Converse, which are very thin and very pliable sole, I don't have as many issues. Some people have added extra pieces of grip tape, foam, other things to the sensor pad right on top of the stock grip tape. That seems to work because when you place your foot on it, it does add extra pressure and increase the likelihood that the sensor will activate and you'll be good to go. There is a more destructive and permanent fix that I've seen where a user will take the grip tape off and then remove that extra plastic film from on top of the sensor and then just reapply grip tape to that. That is a bit more of a permanent fix. It would take a bit more skill and a bit more care in doing it without damaging the sensor, but by all accounts that I've seen and read, that does restore the sensitivity of the sensor, and so that is also an option that you may or may not think is worth doing. Now, doing a more permanent fix, or rather taking a more permanent route to address the sensitivity concerns that you would have with the newer foot pads, there's always going to be a risk when you modify something. Riding a Onewheel itself carries risks, but I think that there are certain considerations that are worth talking about and thinking about when it comes to the foot sensor and why it may or may not have been the case that they made it less sensitive than it used to be. It's hard to say exactly. I don't believe Future Motion have made a statement on it, and I don't think that they will. And so everything that I am saying and I'm going to say is entirely speculation. Take that for what it's worth. I'm just an idiot on the internet, so I am entirely capable of being nothing but wrong. And so that being said, if I were to take some sort of assumptions on the sensitivity issue with the foot pads, if you ride Onewheels long enough and around enough people, you'll see ghost boards. Those are a thing. It's when the foot sensor sticks and the motor stays activated whether or not the rider is on it. So if a rider comes off a board and the sensor sticks on and the motor is still engaged, the board will just travel in whatever direction the nose or tail falls, and it will not stop until it hits something or the motor disengages one way or another. Those occurrences are very dangerous. They can often be extremely destructive, and they're also profoundly risky for people who are not riding, who are just happen to be in the area. And it makes sense that the occurrence of these false positive activations would lead to a desire to lower the occurrence of false positive activations. In making the foot sensor less sensitive, you have a decrease in risk of ghost boards, and the unfortunate price of that is it's harder to activate it when you actually intend to activate the board. Now, I don't know if one trade-off is worth it or if one thing is more desirable than another. Usually when it comes to risk in terms of injury and damage, especially injury of those who are not the rider, who have nothing to do with the one wheel itself, who are just standing in the area and happen to get struck by a ghost board, it would make sense that reducing those incidents is worthwhile, even if it makes the initial activation of the board a bit more inconvenient. This is a recreational device, and it is a relatively dangerous one at that, so being mildly inconvenienced at the start of a ride by just having to either adjust my foot position or add a bit more pressure to the sensor is not something that I think is a deal breaker if you're interested in purchasing a one wheel. To conclude, is it a good change? I don't know. Is it awful? Probably not. Like most things, it's not this terrible earth-shattering thing that warrants quite a lot of outrage. Like most things, it's just meh. It's a mild inconvenience that makes riding an already dangerous thing slightly more of a pain in the rear. If I've missed anything, I do apologize. Please let me know in the comments below if I've missed anything regarding the sensor issues or anything related to that. This is all based on very cursory readings and my own experiences and conversations with other folks who have either newer Pints, newer XRs, or the new Pint X. And so I at least wanted to put that out there into the ether, as it were, and just have it be said. So now that that's out of the way, we're going to go into the rest of the review and talk about the board itself. The ride feel of the Pint X is quite interesting. Having ridden the Pint Regular for the last couple of years since it was released, the Pint X feels very different. The foot stance is more or less the same because body-wise it is the same board. Granted, they took the Pint and increased the battery size and by extension made larger bumpers and then raised the top speed. That's all true. But that is to say that you have the result of the changes in the Pint X giving a ride feel that is markedly different from the Pint Regular. With a noticeably heavier board, the ability to throw it around, to ride it as a very small, nimble type of playful cruiser ride is not there. When I ride the Pint X, it does not feel like the playful, super nimble kind of ride that I got from the original Pint. The extra weight gives it a bit more authority. So what I mean by that is that it does turn much more easily than an XR, but it doesn't turn as easily as a Pint. The extra weight gives a slight bit more resistance. So the original Pint, the Pint Regular as I call it, can be thrown around in a sense. It takes almost nothing to make it turn around. It is remarkably nimble, and a part of that reason is because of how light it is once you get away from the motor. The Pint X, particularly in the rear where the battery is, has enough extra weight to alter the way the board behaves under your feet, specifically in turning. And since, unlike an XR, all of the weight of the board is slightly more centralized in a smaller size, you don't get the same kind of leverage as you do on an XR when you're attempting to do very tight turns or turning at higher speed. The extra weight of the Pint X does give you a bit more resistance, and that is something that you really need to be aware of if you already have a Pint and you're considering moving over to the Pint X. It's neither a good nor a bad thing, it's just something to be aware of. A very good thing, however, is the larger battery that is literally twice the amount of cells as the Pint Regular gives you much more punch, much more perceived or delivered torque, especially on inclines, that if you don't have a Onewheel currently and you're debating whether you should buy the Pint Regular or buy the Pint X, you should definitely just buy the Pint X. The confidence that you get from not just the higher top speed, but from the increase in punch between the Pint Regular and the Pint X makes this the very obvious choice if you don't have a Onewheel and you're considering buying one of these two, be it the X or the Regular. The Pint Regular is indeed lighter. It's easier to pick up by the handle. It's easier to move around and to stash somewhere. I often put a pint in the car, so that way if I have to park somewhere that's very far away, it's not a big deal. I just park wherever I can, grab the board out at the back, and then just ride where I need to go, which I don't really like to do with the XR because it's a bit cumbersome to just toss into a back seat. I got car seats in the car, for the kids, and so squeezing the XR isn't as easy as just squeezing a pint next to something. So that being said, if you live in a hilly area or your intention is to traverse inclines and do a whole lot of complicated riding, the extra punch, power, and authority that you get from the Pint X is absolutely worth it. That being said, if you already own a pint in one form or another, I don't believe it would be a great idea to try to sell that at a major loss just for the sake of getting a Pint X. I still have the Pint Regular. I love it. I put the battery mod on it and it rides pretty much identically, aside from the top speed, to the Pint X now, which is wonderful. And my kids actually are learning to ride the Onewheel on the Regular because I ride this one and then they ride that one along with me. So this isn't a case of the Pint Regular is terrible now and you should never touch it again. Not at all. This is not as large of an upgrade as one would think from the Pint Regular. So if you currently have a pint and you are, for the most part, content, I don't really think it would be the wisest decision to sell it for the sake of an X. If you're itching for more and you like the Onewheel form factor because it's for you and you dig the ride and you want something that's way more than a pint, I would just get a GT. The Pint X, for me personally, is not enough more. There's not enough moreness there from the Pint Regular to warrant either just buying this or selling the pint if you've already got one. If you have an XR, should you get the Pint X? Probably not. The XR is excellent. I will never be rid of it. So if you have an XR and you are content with the XR ride and you think that this will offer you more, it will not. It will offer you what the XR does in a smaller package. So all you're actually going to change between the XR and the Pint X is the ride feel, the way it responds under your feet. And I don't think it's an entirely positive change unless you're a very lightweight or slightly smaller rider. The decreased foot space on the Pint X as compared to the XR increases the likelihood of foot fatigue, or at the very least, it will make foot fatigue come on sooner. So the larger foot surface of the XR, I think, is more beneficial for longer rides. And once you learn the behavior and responsiveness of the XR, you're not going to get much more from this. So what if you have an older pint and you've installed an extended range battery pack and you're considering ditching that for the sake of the Pint X? Should you do that? No. I mean, the top speed does make a bit of a difference, and when riding this, the higher top speed, before pushback at least, does make this feel less restricted. However, the restrictions of a pint and its pushback, for me personally, are most apparent in straight line riding, which is not something I do a lot with the pint. For me, straight line riding usually happens on the XR and presumably will be the GT because a larger board makes straight line riding at higher speeds not just more stable, but in my opinion, more enjoyable. Straight line riding on the pint is fairly boring, not just because of the speed restrictions, but because of the way it interacts with my foot and the foot fatigue that comes in earlier. It's not the kind of thing where I have a very fun experience riding for long stretches at high speeds in a straight line. So if you have a modded pint, if I were choosing things, I would say take your modded pint, go get an external battery mod and run it in parallel so you can get all that extra punch that you would normally get from a Pint X and still have even more range than this. I'd say that would be a better investment. It would probably be way less expensive if you sold what you had just to get this. And unless you're really itching for a higher top speed, which I wouldn't be, because again, not really a speed riding thing, I still would stick with a modified Pint over this. Is the Pint X worth it? I don't know. It depends on what you mean by worth it. They're charging you $1,400 for this machinery. That's a lot of money. The Pint is a lot of money. So is it worth it? If you don't currently own a Onewheel at all and you want to own a Onewheel, this is a good place to start. If ordering a GT right now before it's been released or even after it's been released seems like a very sketchy proposition for you at its current price point, this is a decent entry point into the world of being a Onewheel owner and Onewheel rider. If you already have a Pint, should you upgrade, or rather, in my opinion, slight upside grade to the Pint X? Probably not. I don't think it would be worth the trouble of selling an original Pint just to get this. I think you'd be better served waiting until you get a GT, or probably even just going for a different form factor if you're into expanding your PEV horizons. What if you have an XR? Should you ditch the XR for a Pint X? Absolutely not. No, under no circumstances would I sell my XR to be able to get a Onewheel Pint X. I don't think that that would be a good idea. All right, so now I would like to conclude by saying that I do very much like the Onewheel Pint X. I enjoy how it rides, I ride it every day, and I don't want to come off as if I don't like it, because it's not the case. It's a very good product, I very much appreciate it, and it continues to provide the one-wheel ride experience that one would expect. That being said, it's not that much of an upgrade from a Pint Regular. It's certainly not an upgrade from an XR. And if that's the case, stick with what you have and be content, because this is something you would get if you just felt like having a Pint X. So if you have the money for it and you just feel like getting a Pint X because it's one of the new ones, a review is probably not going to sway you in one way or the other. You're just going to buy what you want to buy. As always, thank you so much for your viewership. If you haven't already, please subscribe. There's a lot more Onewheel electric skateboard and DIY content coming your way. Huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. I am very, very grateful for your support. And as always, don't fall. But most importantly, take care of yourself.